almost 1 in every of 20 Proverbs addresses work. So we get the sense that the wisdom teachers understood that work was so central to life and part of the fabric of how God has ordered the world in which we live. God is a worker. He's created us to work with him in the care of the world and others in it. He established a working week as part of his creation order. 6 days to work and a day of rest to be kept holy as a reminder that we are absolutely and utterly dependent upon him. In other words, so that we wouldn't be tempted to work without him. So work is not just important, it's an important part of what it means to be human. David Hubbard writes, God, the master worker, has built the need and joy of work into the very stuff of his universe and his people. Now, of course, we not only live in light of God's creation, but also in the light of the fall. And the brokenness of sin now distorts work, making it frustrating, sometimes even oppressive. And the book of Proverbs recognizes that as well. It observes that though work is part of God's design for us, it's also been impacted by sin. Not only externally, now we have even greater need to till and to tend to the earth. And you know, sometimes that's much more arduous. We need to be working the world around us. But also the impact of the fall upon the human heart. Our attitudes, our motivations, and choices when it comes to putting our hand to the plow. And so while we find ourselves contending with the fall, the book of Proverbs has much wisdom to offer us in terms of how we might set about redeeming work by applying wisdom. And this is where I want us to go this morning. What might it look like to apply wisdom to our work so as to redeem it for the glory of God? And so I want to offer sort of 3 steps, if you like, or 3 ways that we might think about applying wisdom. And the first is to see your work through God's greater story. And it's actually asking yourself the question, how am I contributing to God's greater story through my work? And this, of course, speaks to our motivation. This is why we work. Now, our daily work, whether challenging or mundane, is part of something far greater. It's part of God's unfolding plan in the world. We're not just working for ourselves, but for something greater. And the book of Proverbs teaches us that true wisdom is lived in right relationship to God. We've already seen that. And it teaches us that right relationship to God includes adopting his purposes for us for how we are to live in the world he created. Now, the rest of the Bible helps us understand his purposes as part of a greater story. And that's the story of creation, fall, redemption, and restoration. So creation, that work was part of God's original design. It's good. It's part of our role in being able to cultivate and steward this world that he has given us. But that got distorted because of the fall. That sin has distorted and frustrated this work. But then we have redemption, the cross, the gospel, the death of Jesus and the resurrection means that through Jesus, work can be restored to its rightful purpose of bringing order, justice, and flourishing to society. And then, of course, we have restoration, that God one day will renew all things. And we get to work as part of this anticipation of God's renewal. And so our work finds its purpose in the midst of this greater story. Tim Keller writes, we are to see work as a way of cultivating and caring for the world as God originally intended, resisting the effects of sin and looking forward to the renewal of all things. Now, this means that work, whether that be paid or unpaid, seen or unseen, whether it be done in a team or alone, is not merely about survival, nor is it primarily about personal fulfillment. Rather, it's a way to serve God and to contribute to human flourishing. It means that a job that may not feel personally fulfilling still carries deep purpose when, for example, it provides for others, demonstrating self-sacrificial love. It also means that our own self-fulfillment is not the primary goal of our work. It might be an outcome of it, but it's not the primary goal. In God's design, work is about serving something greater than ourselves. And so when we begin to reframe our work as part of God's greater story, then it transforms the tasks we don't enjoy or that seem less prestigious, because their dignity is not found in how much we enjoy them or how well they pay or who sees it, but in the fact that they are done for God's glory and for the good of others. And seeing our work as part of God's story also humbles us. It humbles us because it reminds us that we are called to live for others rather than for our own advantage or personal fulfillment. There's an extra element to this, that if we are God's handiwork, as Ephesians 2 verse 10 tells us, and if he is the potter and we are the clay, then that means that God will use everything in our lives, including our daily tasks, our work, our activities, our chores, our jobs, to shape us into his likeness. Our character at work is almost just as important to God, dare I say even more important, as what we produce, achieve, or accomplish with our hands. Who we are becoming is just as important as what we do. And I'm going to talk about that a little bit more in a moment. But perhaps for some of us sitting here this morning, we fail to see how our work really matters to God's greater story. And so we don't think that what we do every day is really that significant in God's kingdom. Or it's not as important as what other people do. Or it's not as spiritual as what Tash and Simon do. Well, it's just not true. The truth is if we begin to see our daily tasks in a different way, as we begin to see our roles, our responsibilities, our jobs, our tasks as part of God's story, then what we do really matters. And so we might like to reflect upon that by thinking about, well, how do my tasks serve God's purposes of bringing order, beauty, and healing into the world? Or how does what I do resist the effects of sin in the world? Or how does my tasks offer hope to others? In other words, anticipating that time when God will renew all things. And what am I learning through it? For example, if I think about my first job, it was driving a tractor. And I was 10 years old. And on the family farm, I had to drive the tractor and pull a water container behind me so that the others, the boys, got to hand water the pumpkins and the watermelons. And what was I doing in light of God's greater story? Well, I could say I was driving a tractor, or I could say I was feeding the nation. Does feeding people matter to God? Does that contribute to human flourishing? Absolutely. And I was part of that. Now, I didn't particularly like driving the tractor in the heat of the summer sun in Australia. It was a bit mind-numbing, and I would much rather be in my room drawing or creating or playing music. But still, I was part of feeding a nation. And through it, I learnt the merits of hard work. Literally the principles that what you sow and tend to, you will reap. Now, my next job, I was 14, was becoming a violin teacher, and I had a little student who was 6 years old. And what was I doing in teaching her the violin? Well, I wasn't just teaching the violin, but I was unlocking the creative potential in children and helping them to see their value. Now, does that matter to God, that people discover who they are and value themselves? Does it matter? Absolutely. And what did I learn through that? I learned the challenges of human nature and the will, and how to inspire and motivate, encourage, and that different things work for different people. No two people are the same. And then I think about my job now, my most significant job as a mother. What am I doing? I am raising up the next generation of hopefully responsible citizens who will make their contribution to society. That sometimes is in question. I'm also spotting and nurturing God-given talent in them that will hopefully mean that they'll bring something of God's beauty and justice and goodness into the world. I'm coaching them in life and wisdom. I'm discipling them in a way that helps them to see who God is and his heart for them. Now, does that all matter to God? Absolutely. And what am I learning? I'm learning a lot of patience and perseverance. At the moment, I'm learning the art of conflict management. I'm learning to trust God for their lives. And I'm learning that sometimes it's the jobs that are not paid that are often the most rewarding. So I want you to take a moment and maybe just turn to the person next to you. Think about your average week and the work or the jobs or the tasks that you put your hand to. Whether that be paid or unpaid, it doesn't matter. And reframe that by answering the question, how does this fit into God's greater story? For example, how does it bring goodness, healing, hope, truth, justice, and beauty in the world? How does it contribute to human flourishing? How does it serve the good of others? How does it restrain the impact of sin in our world? And what are you learning through that? So would you take a moment and turn to the person next to you and just reflect upon that for a moment? Okay, so maybe that's something you can just keep pondering, keep thinking about. I'd encourage you to keep thinking about that this week. You know, so often at times people ask us, what do you do? And you simply say, I'm a pastor or I'm a mother. But think about how would you describe that in a different way that reframes that in a way that speaks to the greater story, God's story that you're a part of. The second aspect of applying wisdom at work is to practice diligence as devotion. And this is really about how we work. And I said this earlier, that how we work is just as important to God as why we work. Because how we work speaks to who we are becoming. It speaks about our character and our sense of identity. And in the book of Proverbs, we have descriptions of what is known, as I said earlier, as the diligent and the lazy or the sluggard. And we have some fantastic descriptions. It's worth reading through the book of Proverbs because sometimes it's incredibly entertaining. But we have Proverbs chapter 19, verse 24 that says, a sluggard buries his hand in the dish, he will not even bring it back to his mouth. It's describing someone that's so lazy, they've got the food right there in front of them and they cannot even lift it to their mouth. And then Proverbs 20, verse 4 said, sluggards do not plow in season, so at harvest time they look but find nothing. In other words, they don't put in the work when it's needed, so naturally there's no results. And then Proverbs 12, verse 24 says, diligent hands will rule, but laziness ends in forced labor. In other words, the diligent will have opportunities open up to them, but the lazy are forced to do that which they don't want to do. And that's just a flavor of the different proverbs that we have in relation to diligence and laziness. In fact, I think there's about 18 different proverbs that relate to that. But if we start to put all these proverbs together, then we start to get a picture of what the lazy look like in comparison to the diligent. I put together a bit of a table I want to see that you can put up there. And sometimes comparison is really helpful. So we have the lazy who avoids work and makes excuses as compared to the diligent who works consistently and with excellence. The lazy disregard God's commands for effort, while the diligent honors God with faithful labor. The diligent are careless and content. The lazy are careless and content with inactivity, whilst the diligent are committed and focused on purpose. Their work is purposeful. The lazy naturally end up in situations of poverty and ruin, while the diligent, the outcomes is prosperity and satisfaction. Now, just as a way aside, whenever the book of Proverbs mentions prosperity, we're not talking about an abundance of wealth necessarily, but rather a stability and well-being. We have the lazy who relies on laziness or chance, whereas the diligent relies on God's guidance and blessing. And then the lazy lacks foresight and planning, where the diligent seeks wisdom and plans ahead. And so you see, at the heart of the lazy is really what I would say, describe as an abdication. Now, I just want to say this from the outside, that the book of Proverbs is not talking about those of us who might want to work, but for whatever reason we're unable to. It's not describing that. It's describing those who are able to work, but who are abdicating their responsibility. And they're those who are abdicating their part in God's greater story, abdicating responsibility for themselves and others in their lives, and abdicating the God-given dignity afforded them in work. And this abdication is serious, the book of Proverbs tells us, because it has consequences, not just for the person in question, but for a society as a whole. If a whole society is made up of people like this, it will not flourish. David Hubbard observes that laziness then, however cool and laid back it may seem, is big league mayhem. It saps a society of its will to achieve, undermines the values of the young, makes it dependent on outside resources, and abdicates the divinely assigned role of co-regency in the stewardship of creation. Now, I want to add a third group of people into this as well, because while the book of Proverbs never explicitly gives a name to this, there is a third category of people that we are cautioned not to be like, and they would be what I have called the striving. And if abdication is the key characteristic of the lazy, then greed is the core motivation of the striving. And there's plenty of proverbs that speak about the danger of work that is primarily motivated by greed. And greed here is not necessarily just about wealth, but it's rather about this selfish desire to attain something, whether that be wealth, power, prestige, notoriety, or material possessions, often at the expense of others. And so it's this excessive craving that goes beyond basic needs and prioritizes personal gain over generosity, fairness, or contentment. So if you look, again, we've got a table. I think I've got a table of the three together. If you compare the diligent with the striving, you have the striving who works excessively, often with anxiety, as compared to the diligent who works consistently with excellence. The striving tend to trust in self rather than God. They tend to be anxious and driven by some form of attainment. Proverbs describes their wealth as fleeting and has a sort of emptiness about it. It talks about them relying on personal effort rather than on God, and an ignorance around wisdom, often focusing in on the immediate gain instead of long-term well-being. So they have sort of a comparison between the three. So if I was to sort of summarize that and put it on a bit of a sliding scale, the lazy ignores God's calling to work and suffers the natural consequences. Whereas the striving on the other side of the spectrum is trust in work instead of God and experience emptiness and anxiety. But in the middle, we have the diligent who honor God through faithful work and experience the blessings that come with that, the well-being that arises from that in all sorts of directions, from stability to contentment to joy to being able to be generous and have good standing within their community. Now, by temperament, and maybe by upbringing, and maybe by virtue of the different cultures or contexts that we find ourselves in, we might find ourselves leaning in one direction more than the other. Or we might find ourselves at different moments in our life flitting between the two. And maybe we even look at that chart and we think, oh, I can see aspects of that in me. And I can see aspects of that in me. Well, Proverbs gives us the opportunity to hold the mirror up to our working lives and ask ourselves, in these categories associated with our work, what do I observe about my approach to work? And what does that tell me about my character and therefore my view of God? So I want you to take a moment and maybe just on your own, just reflect when it comes to your character and approach to work. Do you observe any aspects of laziness or striving in you? And what would it look like for you to practice diligence out of devotion to God? So just take 1 minute, maybe on your own, maybe you want to write something down on your phone, and just take a little moment to reflect upon that. We'll continue to ponder upon that. The third aspect of applying wisdom to our work is to grow your gifts for God's glory. And this is about stewarding what we have and getting good at what we do. And I love this proverb. It's Proverbs 22, verse 29. It says, "Do you see someone skilled in their work? They will serve before kings. They will not serve before officials of low rank." Now, the word skilled here has to do with excellence in a craft that comes through experience and diligence. And we don't often reflect upon excellence. But what I've noticed is that the book of Proverbs encourages excellence in your work, not as a means of getting more money or notoriety, but rather as a way to honor God through making much of that which He has given you. Proverbs 23, verse 4 to 5 says, "Do not wear yourself out to get rich. Do not trust in your own cleverness. Cast but a glance at riches, and they are gone. For they will surely sprout wings and fly off to the sky like an eagle." And so when you take these two proverbs together, you see that the call to excellence in our work is not about wealth, but actually about stewardship. And stewardship takes seriously the gifts that God has given you and uses them for their utmost to His glory. Now, wisdom observes that as you steward those gifts, that further doors open up to you, that you become a blessing to those not only around you, but to those in positions of leadership over you. Not only because of your skills that are now beneficial to others, but because of the kind of person that you have become in the development of those skills. I automatically think of Daniel in this regard. If you think of Daniel and his fellow comrades who are exiled into Babylon, they're robbed of their identity, their culture, they're stripped of their names and their country, and yet they make the most of where God has put them and what He has placed in their hands. We read that Daniel becomes an outstanding student, that he excels, and that he therefore stands before kings and advises kings. Becoming skilled requires a combination of hard work, but also this attitude that says, I'm going to make the most of the gifts that God has given me, whether that be natural talents, aptitude, opportunities, access to learning, access to people, time, resources, or energy. And I want to share with you a story about my younger brother because I think it illustrates really well this aspect of stewardship. My younger brother, Joel, has taken on the family farm. And truth be told, he was told from about 3 years of age that he would have to take on the farm. He had no choice. Basically, I have 3 brothers. My parents could see that my oldest brother was very studious. He's become a computer IT technician. My next brother was off with the fairies most of the time. He's become a pastor. And so they just knew it was going to be my younger brother. Now, my younger brother, though, he had this natural talent with his hands. He was, from a very young age, I remember him being incredibly curious about how things work and trying to make them work better. He would often, in his spare time, be pulling apart electrical things and noticing how they work and putting them back together again, which at one point led me to rescue him from being electrocuted. But he had this curiosity and this aptitude for how things worked and how he could make them better. He took over the farm about 12 years ago. My dad handed it over to him. And my brother began to ask himself the question, well, how do I make the most of what God has given me? And so he applied himself to researching around land management, soil, agriculture, and he's decided to make a very big change to how they worked the land, which my dad was pretty, let's just say at first, not so pleased about. But he moved the farm basically from the cattle roaming free across the entire property to what's called cellular farming, where he divided up the property into smaller cells. And to do it, he would have to make a big investment. It would require the investment of time, money, and energy. It would take a lot of work to get this going initially. He needed to remove trees, put in new fences, weld new gates, plan out the boundaries of the fencing on the property. But he applied his natural aptitude, his knowledge, and his hand-on skills to the farm. And 12 years later, the farm has become much more productive than it ever was. A few things have happened. Firstly, he's increased the natural productivity of the land. Because what happens is, instead of the cattle roaming free over that entire property, he moves the cattle from cell to cell, which means that the land gets to rest. And it also means that the natural fertilizer from the cows gets to replenish the land. It means the cattle have become calmer. So literally, my brother moves the cattle around every 2 to 3 days. He goes to the gate and he simply calls out to them, and the cattle come running to him and they move into their next cell because the grass is greener on the other side. But they're much calmer, and it's terrible to say this, but every farmer knows that calmer cattle means better meat. He's also decreased the time spent in mustering cattle from the four corners of the farm, because now what he simply does is he makes sure he moves the cattle around at the right time to the place where he needs them to be at the right time. And he's decreased the use of poison on the land because the cattle, given no other option, eat the weeds in the paddocks. And I just want to share with you, for me, I find that incredibly fascinating. I think that's excellence at work in farming. That's the application of wisdom. Diligently working at something and growing what you have been given. And it's excellence that's good for the land, it's good for the cattle, it's good for sustainable food production, it's good for Joel's family because it's actually released a lot of time for him. It means he can spend his time and talents giving to others. Now, of course, my brother regularly admits that he was given an incredible opportunity of the farm, an incredible gift by the grace of God. Nevertheless, he could have squandered it, or he could have kept things as they were. Instead, out of gratitude, he has made much of the gift that he was given for the glory of God and for the good of others. Now, not many of us will be given a farm in our lives. And, it's really true that in this life, we don't all start with an equal footing. The fallenness in our world means that some of us may have been given less than others. But still, stewardship is about saying to God, with what I have, help me to make much of it for your glory. In fact, I think there is also a flip side of that. For those who have been given much, Jesus tells us much is expected. And so we have an even greater responsibility to steward well that which we have been given and to exercise generosity as an antidote for ever thinking that what we have has come to us through our own effort, when in fact, perhaps we've started out from a blessed position. So let me ask you, what do you have in your hands that you could work at? And not just work at, but excel at for the glory of God. What has God given you that you need to seriously consider how to steward well? And what opportunities has he laid in your lap that you could take hold of wholeheartedly as part of your honoring him? It'd be good for you to think about that perhaps this coming week. So as we think about this today, what does wisdom look like at work? How do we redeem our work by applying wisdom? These three things. See your work as part of God's greatest story. Practice diligence as devotion. And grow your gifts to the glory of God. I want us to take a moment to respond today. And you'll see these lovely trees set up over here. Please don't judge this tree against that tree. Sometimes it's the little things. The little things are the most significant. But I want you to think for a moment about these three aspects. And maybe if you go to the next slide, if you were to think about your own work, how are you reframing that in light of God's story? I talked about if somebody asked you, what do? What would you say? If you're an accountant, you might say something like this: I'm helping people to steward their wealth with integrity and with generosity, holding back the impact of greed in the world. That's part of God's bigger story. It'd be good for you to have a think about that. And then have a think about, how do you want to practice diligence this week? Does it mean putting your phone away at the workplace? Does it mean bringing prayer into your workplace? What would it look like for you to practice diligence? And how do you want to make much of the gifts that God has given you? Perhaps there's something the Holy Spirit is kind of just reminding you of, and you're thinking, actually, I really want to excel at that. God's given that to me. I want to use that for him and for his kingdom. And so I'd encourage you, maybe take a photo of that and think about that this week. But we've got up the front here some leaves on this table and these trees. And what I love about the tree is it represents God's bigger story. Because if you think about the tree, we have a tree in the Garden of Eden, the tree of life, that represents God's creation and his sustaining of all of life. In the same garden, we have the tree of good, the knowledge of good and evil, that represents humanity's falling into the trap of trying to do things without God and sin entering into the world. And then we have the tree of redemption, where Jesus dies on the cross in order to restore us back into relationship with our Heavenly Father. And then, of course, in the book of Revelations, we have the tree of life, whose leaves bear healing for the nations. This idea that God will restore all things. And so I want to encourage you to come up the front, and you'll find these leaves. And perhaps you have a prayer for your work. Maybe you want to pray, just write a prayer that you want to honor God with your work. Maybe you're finding your work really difficult right now and you want to ask for God's help in that. Maybe you're facing some uncertainty in your working life or a transition and you want to ask the Lord to help you in that. Whatever it is for you, I want to invite you to come forward, and Cam's going to sing a song over us as we do. And it's called The Worker's Prayer. He's going to sing that over us, and I want to invite you to respond to the Lord today by bringing to him your work and whatever need you have, and just offering it to him. You can write on those little leaves, grab a piece of string, and then hang it on the tree. Don't write your name on it, because later tonight at our prayer and worship evening, we're going to spend some time praying over those leaves. So please respond today as Cam sings the words of this song.